You are a royal physician in Madrid. The year is 1834, and Spain trembles in transition. King Ferdinand VII is dead, yet your work is far from finished. At dawn, you are summoned to the private chambers of the late monarch, not to tend to the living, but to preserve what remains. The corridors are silent, muffled under the weight of grief, fear, and curiosity. Outside the palace walls, Madrid itself is unsettled. Cholera stalks the streets, whispers of revolt stir, and the looming question of succession sharpens every glance. But here, behind locked doors, your task is not politics or medicine in the conventional sense. It is something far stranger, a ritual at the edge of science and superstition. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, waits within, draped in black lace, her eyes red with sleepless tears. She greets you not as a sovereign, but as a woman cornered by fate. Her request chills the marrow of your bones. You approach the body of the man who had ruled Spain with cruelty, paranoia, and endless contradictions. Ferdinand lies on silk sheets, his pale face already waxen in death. Yet it is not his countenance that commands your gaze. Beneath the embroidered covers lies the physical secret that had shadowed his entire reign, a grotesque anatomical reality, whispered of for decades in palace corridors, but never admitted in official chronicles. Historians will one day reduce his monarchy to wars, betrayals, and reactionary decrees. But you, standing here, know that his life was also defined by flesh. A body that mocked him, mocked his wives, and, in ways few dared to say aloud, mocked the kingdom itself. The silence thickens as you begin your work. You prepare the preservation, your hands steady yet trembling with awareness. You are not merely embalming a king, you are sealing a legacy, a relic that embodies both shame and power, private torment and public disaster. The weight of history presses on your shoulders. For even as you handle this grim task, your mind cannot help but wander. You recall the whispered stories passed among courtiers of velvet cushions engineered for purposes no artisan ever admitted, of queens' screams muffled by laudanum, of failed heirs mourned like national calamities. You realize that what you are preserving is not just human tissue, but a symbol, a grotesque metaphor for a reign that had itself been deformed, swollen, and destructive to everything it touched. This is how our journey begins, not with parades, not with proclamations, but in the dim chamber of a dead king. To understand Ferdinand VII, to comprehend the ruin he left behind, we must follow his story backwards. We must trace how one man's intimate affliction became a curse for a nation. And to do so, we must first look at his beginning, at the poisoned cradle of inbred royalty, where destiny twisted him into what he became. Ferdinand was born beneath the vaulted ceilings of El Escorial on the 14th of October, 1784, his first cries echoing through stone corridors that had witnessed centuries of Spanish power and decline. His arrival should have been a cause for celebration, a new Bourbon prince to continue the dynasty, but those who understood Spain's royal bloodlines already knew the child's fate had been sealed long before he drew breath. For generations, Spain's ruling houses had collapsed their family trees into twisted knots of cousin marriages, uncle-to-niece unions, and dynastic bargains that valued continuity above health. The Habsburgs had already shown the grotesque cost of this practice. Charles II, the Bewitched, had been so riddled with deformities and infertility that he died without heir, his jaw misshapen, his body a canvas of genetic ruin. The Bourbons who succeeded him learned nothing from that tragedy. They repeated the pattern, wedding cousins to cousins, as though their thrones could only be secured by keeping the blood pure, no matter how corrupted it became. Ferdinand's parents were Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, first cousins, their marriage as much a consolidation of dynastic pride as it was a union of flesh. Court doctors, well aware of the risks, whispered in private correspondence that the lottery of heredity has been stacked against the infant prince. The language was cautious, for no one dared openly accuse God's chosen dynasty of folly, but the truth was plain. Nature had been cornered, and the boy was the price. As Ferdinand grew, signs emerged that this royal child was marked by some cruel twist of fate. His body developed in ways that defied classical ideals. By adolescence, physicians noted with unease that his most private anatomy had grown beyond proportion or normality, as though some malign inheritance had reshaped him into a living reminder of dynastic hubris. Notes hidden in Vatican archives spoke with clinical detachment, but carried undertones of horror. One physician wrote that, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove challenging." Oh, in another account, less veiled, The description carried the sting of mockery disguised as observation. The prince's organ resembles a billiard cue, thin at the root, swelling grotesquely toward the extremity, long enough to serve as a walking stick. Such words, though never admitted into official reports, trickled through the palace in hushed whispers. In the gilded salons of Madrid, servants snickered behind hands, and foreign diplomats wrote back to their courts of Spain's latest royal embarrassment. The psychological toll on the boy was enormous. In an age when aristocratic masculinity prized proportion, refinement, and control, Ferdinand embodied the opposite. The Greeks had once sculpted gods with smaller organs, symbols of discipline and reason. To be oversized was to be barbaric, uncontrolled, animal. And so what some modern minds might have envied, in Ferdinand's time marked him as a freak. Every gesture, every glance, he came to interpret as mockery. Even polite bows felt to him like smirks. His childhood was no sanctuary. His father Charles IV was gentle but weak, a monarch more devoted to hunting than to ruling. His mother, Maria Luisa, was voracious in appetite and notoriously close to Manuel de Godoy, the Prince of Peace, who wielded real power in Spain. Young Ferdinand watched humiliation unfold daily: his mother's open infidelities, his father's passivity, and the courtier's thinly veiled disdain. For a child already haunted by his own physical abnormality, this theatre of betrayal taught a harsh lesson. Power was not about love or loyalty, but about control and appearances. The court itself was a labyrinth of rumor. Whispers slid through corridors like drafts. A prince's slightest weakness became a feast for gossip, and Ferdinand's condition was too grotesque to remain secret. He came to see ridicule even where none was intended. Tutors noted a boy who grew secretive, spiteful, and cruel to servants. By his teenage years, his humiliation had calcified into resentment into paranoia. He was learning that in a world where he was mocked for what he could not control, he could still wield power to punish those who dared laugh. In those formative years, Spain's dynastic curse had already carved itself deep into Ferdinand's psyche. The child of centuries of inbreeding, he was more than just a malformed body. He was the living embodiment of decay, a symbol of a dynasty collapsing in on itself. And though few could yet see it, the boy growing up in the palaces of Madrid would carry this private shame like a toxin, spreading it outward until it poisoned an entire kingdom. Adolescence should have been the season of promise, a time for Ferdinand to step into the rituals of royal maturity, hunting parties, courtly dances, the measured tutelage of statesmen. Instead, it became the crucible in which his shame was smelted into cruelty. By the time he reached his teenage years, whispers about the prince's deformity were no longer confined to medical notes. They moved through the palace like smoke. Servants stifled laughter behind their hands, foreign envoys sent amused letters home, and even tutors, tasked with shaping a king, found their lessons undermined by furtive glances and private jokes. To live in a palace was to live in a hive of gossip, and Ferdinand's secret was the juiciest morsel of all. Every bow felt to him like a smirk, every polite phrase like hidden ridicule. He became convinced that mockery lurked behind every word, every smile, every lowered eye. This was not entirely delusion, people really were talking, but his sensitivity magnified the wound until paranoia became the prism through which he saw the world. He did not just feel mocked, he expected it, and worse, he remembered it. Ferdinand began keeping lists of those he believed had laughed at him, storing insults like debts he intended to collect. His tutors recorded troubling changes. Once pliant and eager to please, the prince grew sullen, secretive, and vindictive. He learned early that the power of a crown to be could compensate for the powerlessness of his body. A careless word from a servant, a misstep in etiquette, could be answered with dismissal or worse. One story, whispered in memoirs decades later, reveals the darkness taking root. A young page, no older than Ferdinand himself, accidentally entered his chamber while the prince was half-dressed. For most royals, such an incident would be shrugged off with embarrassment. For Ferdinand, it was intolerable. The boy was flogged, his family banished from Madrid. The message was unmistakable. No one could witness the prince's shame and survive unpunished. The palace meant to be a world of gilded ceilings, and ritual harmony became for Ferdinand a theatre of humiliation. He hardened himself in response. Where he once sought affection, he now cultivated suspicion. Where he once might have laughed, he learned to sneer. If he could not control his own body, he would control others absolutely. European culture of the late 18th century only deepened the wound. Aristocratic masculinity prized refinement, restraint, and proportion. Ancient statuary was the model. Small, balanced, harmonious. Ferdinand's condition violated every expectation. To his mind, he was not just malformed, he was grotesque, monstrous, an object of disgust even to those who outwardly praised him. In that sense, his paranoia had fuel. He was an heir who embodied his dynasty's curse, and he knew it. The irony was cruel. The very thing that modern men might have boasted of as a mark of virility was, in Ferdinand's world, the brand of barbarism. His body was not a gift but a prison, and so, instead of learning empathy from his vulnerability, he grew convinced that the world was his enemy. Better to be feared than to be mocked. In adolescence, the mask of tyranny began to form. He would wear it for life, hiding his shame behind cruelty and his paranoia behind power. Spain, though it did not yet realize it, was watching its next king become something far worse than weak, a man shaped by humiliation, one who would wield the scepter not as a symbol of service, but as a weapon of vengeance. In 1802, the bells of Madrid rang in celebration. Streets filled with banners, music, and the rhythmic pounding of drums as Spain prepared for the marriage of its prince, Ferdinand, to his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. For a kingdom wearied by decline and scandal, the wedding was a pageant of hope, a chance to display the Bourbon dynasty's splendor before the eyes of Europe. The cathedral blazed with candlelight, foreign dignitaries crowded its aisles, and the young couple appeared as if carved from the romantic ideals of royalty. She, radiant and intelligent; he, stiff and awkward, but cloaked in the aura of future kingship. To the public, it was a fairy tale union. To those within the palace walls, it was a union already shadowed by whispers. Physicians had long known that Ferdinand carried an affliction which might make consummation less a rite of joy than a medical ordeal. And so preparations began not with poetry or passion, but with tools. Royal craftsmen were commissioned to fashion peculiar contraptions, pillows, wedges, and supports discreetly labeled marital aids. Bottles of oils and tinctures lined the bedchamber as if it were an infirmary. The stage was set not for romance, but for something closer to a surgical procedure. Maria Antonia was a girl of 19, raised in Naples on tales of heroic princes and dynastic duty. She had heard Ferdinand called El Deseado, the Desired One, by those who supported his future claim. She arrived with naive hope, prepared to become both wife and queen. Yet her education had left her unprepared for reality. In an era when even queens received vague and modest instruction about conjugal life, Maria Antonia entered the wedding night ignorant of what awaited her. The moment Ferdinand entered the chamber, her illusions shattered. Accounts preserved in private letters describe her reaction as hysterical. She screamed as though she had seen the devil himself, backing against the wall, pointing at her husband's naked form and crying out, "Monster!" The witnesses, her ladies-in-waiting, never forgot it. What should have been the tender unveiling of a husband was instead the revelation of something alien, grotesque, and terrifying. The ritual that followed bore no resemblance to marital intimacy. It was closer to a clinical operation. Physicians already waiting in the antechamber were summoned to guide the horrified princess. The custom-made cushions were arranged, oils applied, and laudanum administered to dull her fear and pain. In England and France, laudanum was a fashionable tonic, a mixture of wine and opium used to soothe nerves. In Madrid, it became Maria Antonia's only refuge against her husband's demands. The bedchamber transformed into a theatre of suffering, a young queen medicated into compliance, a king ashamed yet insistent, doctors hovering like attendants at a grotesque experiment. Months turned to years, and what should have been a union of dynasties became a cycle of trauma. Each attempt to conceive an heir was prepared with the precision of ritual. Cushions placed, laudanum measured, attendants dismissed, doors locked. The result was always the same. Maria Antonia left trembling, her nerves frayed, her spirit drained. She grew pale and thin, dependent on opium to endure her marital duties. The court whispered that she was wasting away under the weight of her husband's abnormality. And yet, against all odds, she did conceive twice. Both pregnancies ended in heartbreak. In 1804, a miscarriage at 4 months. In 1805, another, crueler loss. A child carried almost to term but lost in bloody, agonizing labor that nearly killed her. Physicians spoke cautiously of a delicate constitution, but privately admitted that the violence of the conjugal act itself had undermined her ability to sustain life. Each failed pregnancy deepened Ferdinand's paranoia. He accused his wife of sabotage, of moving deliberately to provoke miscarriages, of harboring secret liberal sympathies that made her unfit to bear Spain's heir. The atmosphere in the palace turned poisonous. Maria Antonia, still little more than a girl, retreated into constant prayer, convinced she was cursed. Her letters reveal a woman consumed by guilt for sins she could not name, begging God to forgive crimes she had never committed. Laudanum became her daily bread, the opiate fog her only escape from a marriage that was less a partnership than a slow execution. In May 1807, she died at just 21 years old. The official cause was listed as fever, but those who had watched her decline knew the truth. She had died of despair, her body hollowed out by addiction, trauma, and grief. Whispers spread that she had been poisoned perhaps by political enemies, perhaps by Ferdinand himself, eager to rid himself of a wife who could not give him an heir. The sudden death of the royal apothecary days later only fueled these suspicions. He was found lifeless in his chambers, a cryptic letter seized by Ferdinand's agents before it could ever be read. Maria Antonia was lowered into the crypt of El Escorial, her brief life swallowed by the same stone that had seen her husband's birth. For Ferdinand, her death was both a release and a curse. Publicly, he mourned. Privately, he was already searching for another bride. His paranoia, sharpened by humiliation, had grown darker still. For the young king in waiting, women were no longer companions but instruments, and when instruments broke, they were replaced. Spain had buried its princess, but the poison that consumed her was still alive, lodged in Ferdinand himself, festering into the cruelty and suspicion that would one day consume an entire kingdom. By the final years of Maria Antonia's short life, Ferdinand had already begun weaving another, more public web of intrigue. His personal humiliation fed a gnawing resentment not only toward his wife, but toward the two figures who dominated his childhood, his mother, Maria Luisa, and her favorite, Manuel de Godoy. Godoy was no ordinary courtier. A handsome guardsman elevated by the Queen's infatuation, he had risen to become Príncipe de la Paz, the Prince of Peace, Spain's de facto ruler. For years, Charles IV drifted in the background, while Godoy signed treaties, brokered alliances, and indulged in luxuries that mocked Spain's crumbling empire. To the people, he embodied corruption. To Ferdinand, he was the man who humiliated his father, cuckolded his mother, and overshadowed his own claim to power. Spain itself was collapsing under the weight of this misrule. The Bourbon dynasty, once masters of a global empire, had been forced into uneasy alliance with Napoleon's France. Naval defeats at Trafalgar in 1805 left the country's coasts exposed, its colonies vulnerable, its pride shattered. Godoy's pro-French policies further inflamed resentment among nobles and generals who dreamed of restoring Spanish honor. Into this fevered atmosphere, Ferdinand stepped with a dangerous mix of paranoia and ambition. In 1807, whispers coalesced into conspiracy. A circle of discontented nobles, bishops, and officers calling themselves the Fernandinos saw in the prince a vessel for their hopes. They styled him El Deseado, the desired one, the savior who would free Spain from Godoy's corruption. They spread pamphlets praising his intelligence, his patriotism, his promise as a reformist king. Behind their propaganda was a gamble that Ferdinand, however flawed, was preferable to the rotting spectacle of Charles IV's court. Yet those closest to Ferdinand already sensed the danger. They mistook his sullenness for calculation, his paranoia for vigilance. What they failed to see was his lack of loyalty to anyone but himself. The conspiracy, later known as the El Escorial affair, was a clumsy attempt at palace revolution. Plans were laid to remove Godoy, sideline Charles IV, and place Ferdinand at the center of power with Napoleon's tacit blessing. Letters were exchanged, secret meetings held in shadowed halls. But secrecy was a fragile thing in a court built on whispers, and in October 1807 the plot was discovered. Faced with exposure, Ferdinand showed his true nature. Rather than standing by the nobles and officers who had risked everything for him, he broke instantly. He confessed in full, pouring out names, details, and schemes to his father and mother, begging forgiveness. Allies who had hailed him as savior found themselves betrayed by the very man they hoped to crown. Arrests followed, imprisonments, and exiles. Ferdinand, meanwhile, slithered back into his parents' good graces, presenting himself as a penitent son rather than a conspirator. The cowardice was breathtaking. In a single stroke, he had shown Spain the pattern that would define his reign. Ferdinand would use men for his ambition and discard them the moment risk outweighed benefit. His loyalty was to no cause, no principle, no friend, only to survival. The irony was bitter. At the very moment Ferdinand exposed his conspirators, Napoleon's ambitions for Spain were quickening. France's emperor saw the Bourbon family as pawns to be moved on his chessboard of empire. The El Escorial affair, rather than securing Ferdinand's future, only highlighted his weakness and his willingness to betray. To Napoleon, he was no savior, he was an exploitable pawn. Spain, already fragile, now tottered on the brink. The conspirators languished in cells or distant estates, while Ferdinand nursed his humiliation and imagined himself destined for greatness. In truth, he had revealed himself for what he was, not the desired one, but a man who would trade friends for safety, allies for scraps of power, and a kingdom's fate for the preservation of his own pride. The stage was set. Within months, Napoleon's armies would march into Spain, and Ferdinand, who had once dreamed of being savior, would find himself not in triumph, but in chains, a king without a throne, his body still cursed, his character now fully unmasked. In the spring of 1808, Spain convulsed. Napoleon's armies poured across the Pyrenees, the Bourbon monarchy crumbled, and Madrid itself erupted in revolt. The uprising of May 2nd, immortalized by Goya's brush in blood and fire, was only the beginning of a war that would scar the land for years. While Spanish guerrillas ambushed French columns in mountain passes and villages were burned in retribution, the supposed savior of Spain, Ferdinand, found himself not on the battlefield, but in a gilded prison. The abdications at Bayonne sealed his fate. Under pressure from Napoleon, both Charles IV and Ferdinand relinquished their crowns, leaving the throne of Spain to the emperor's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Ferdinand, newly styled as king for a matter of weeks, was spirited away to the Château de Valençay in central France. There, surrounded by guards and courtiers, he became less a monarch than a specimen. French physicians, freed from the suffocating protocols of Madrid, approached their captive with scientific curiosity. For 6 years, they examined Ferdinand with clinical precision, charting the grotesque details of his anatomy. Their reports, later unearthed in Napoleonic archives, read like dissections of myth. They described a member so enormous and misshapen that it seemed to belong not to man, but to some grotesque creature of legend. Curvature, abnormal tissues, impossible dimensions. It was as if nature had conspired to make a mockery of royalty. For Ferdinand, the humiliation was exquisite. In Spain, his secret had been whispered behind fans and hidden in coded notes. In France, it was catalogued, sketched, studied. Doctors measured, theorized, and speculated about rare conditions, hormonal imbalances, overgrowth syndromes that might explain this monstrosity. What had once been shame was now science, his body reduced to a case study in medical journals while his kingdom bled. Yet, even in captivity, Ferdinand's obsession never shifted. He filled letters to European courts, not with pleas for Spain's freedom but with inquiries about potential brides. He calculated which princesses might tolerate his special circumstances, which dynasties might overlook his grotesque affliction for the sake of alliance. The irony was grotesque. While peasants starved in Andalusian fields and guerrillas died in Castilian hillsides, their king devoted himself to fantasies of his next wedding night. Back in Spain, the war became a crucible of national identity. Guerrilla fighters, ordinary villagers armed with muskets and knives, harassed Napoleon's veterans with relentless fury. Britain under Wellington poured men and gold into the Iberian struggle, turning Spain into a graveyard for French ambition. Every bridge, every mountain pass became a battlefield. Cities like Zaragoza resisted with legendary ferocity, women and children joining the fight as famine and plague claimed as many as the French bayonets. And what of Ferdinand, their king, El Deseado, the desired one? He spent his exile surrounded by velvet curtains and medical instruments, writing letters that reveal a man disconnected from the catastrophe engulfing his people. While Spaniards invoked his name as a banner of resistance, he planned his return not as a liberator, but as a groom. The Treaty of Valençay in 1813 promised his restoration. Napoleon, weakened by defeat in Russia and stalemated in Spain, was ready to cut losses. Ferdinand signed the agreement with trembling eagerness. In December 1813, after 6 humiliating years, he prepared to return. Yet the Ferdinand who crossed back into Spain was not a chastened monarch forged by adversity. He was the same man he had always been: petty, paranoid, and consumed by his private torments. His captivity had given him no wisdom, only deeper obsessions. The blood spilled in his name, the sacrifices of guerrillas and patriots, had meant nothing to him. Spain had endured its own crucifixion. Ferdinand had endured only his shame. In the spring of 1814, he re-entered Madrid to scenes of delirium. Crowds wept, fell to their knees, and hailed him as the savior returned at last. Flowers rained upon his carriage, hymns rose in the air, and the city echoed with joy. But behind his smile lay the same twisted fears, the same festering resentments. Spain welcomed a king home. What they had received was a tyrant reborn. In 1814, Madrid erupted in a spectacle that seemed to banish the shadows of war. Ferdinand returned from France, no longer the captive of Valencia but once again King of Spain. As his carriage rolled through the capital, men and women dropped to their knees, children tossed flowers, and old veterans wept openly. Priests proclaimed him El Deseado, the Desired One, the monarch who would restore Spain after years of foreign occupation. But Ferdinand was not returning as a savior. Behind his stiff smile, he carried neither gratitude nor resolve. He brought with him the same paranoia, the same obsession with appearances, the same deformity that had haunted him since boyhood. The crowd saw a king reborn. In truth, Spain was welcoming back the same man who had betrayed conspirators, abandoned allies, and squandered exile in self-absorption. Almost immediately, his true nature revealed itself. Where the people expected reform, Ferdinand restored repression. Liberal reforms enacted during the war, the Cadiz Constitution of 1812, a document that had promised Spain a new dawn of rights and representation, were torn apart. He reinstated absolute monarchy, silenced critics, and breathed life into institutions many thought gone forever. Even the Inquisition, the relic of medieval terror, returned under his hand. Spain, having bled for liberty, found itself thrust backward into the iron embrace of tyranny. This political regression was mirrored by his private life. In 1816, Ferdinand entered his second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin chosen in the endless carousel of dynastic alliances. She was 19, hopeful and pious, and like Maria Antonia before her, tragically unprepared for what awaited. The wedding ceremony was magnificent, a pageant of gold and incense that masked the desperation of a king whose first marriage had ended in scandal and death. Nobles whispered that perhaps this time the curse might be lifted, that a fertile young princess might finally give Spain its long-desired heir. Ferdinand, anxious and suspicious, spent the days before the wedding consulting physicians, alchemists, and even a mysterious foreigner rumored to be an Ottoman expert in royal difficulties. But no counsel, no contrivance, could alter what nature had imposed. On the wedding night, the nightmare returned. Despite elaborate preparations, the cushions, the oils, the carefully staged rituals, the scene dissolved into horror. Servants outside the chamber later spoke of screams that echoed through the palace corridors, not cries of passion but of terror. The morning revealed blood-stained sheets and shattered furniture, grim evidence of an encounter that had been closer to torture than union. Maria Isabel, once bright and graceful, emerged from that night broken. Observers noted how she began to stammer, her voice faltering in public appearances. She flinched at the sight of her husband, her hands trembling when he entered a room. Her ladies whispered of nightmares that left her thrashing, of sudden sobbing fits when she thought herself alone. Palace physicians cloaked their reports in euphemism. They spoke of hysterical episodes, of a constitution unsuited to conjugal duties. But what modern eyes recognize is clear. Maria Isabel was a victim of trauma so severe it reshaped her body and mind. For Ferdinand, her fear was intolerable. He interpreted her flinches, her silence, her haunted gaze not as suffering, but as insult. His paranoia, already legendary, now extended into the marriage bed. He became convinced she was conspiring against him, mocking his condition, perhaps even feeding rumors to foreign courts. He ordered her letters intercepted, her meals tasted, her chambers searched for signs of poison or coded messages. Thus, the marriage that had been meant to stabilize Spain became another theater of cruelty and suspicion. Maria Isabel dwindled before the eyes of her attendants, her youth leached away by fear. In 1818, scarcely 2 years after her arrival in Madrid, she died. The court attributed her passing to nervous exhaustion. In truth, her life had been consumed by the same nightmare that had claimed Ferdinand's first wife. Her death shocked Europe, not for its suddenness, but for the pattern it confirmed. 2 queens, young and full of promise, reduced to husks within a few short years. Whispers grew louder. Spain's king was cursed, his bedchamber a place of horror, his wives martyrs to a dynastic obsession. Meanwhile, Spain itself was suffocating. The American colonies, emboldened by liberal ideals and weary of Bourbon neglect, rose in revolt. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, one by one, they slipped away. While generals and revolutionaries reshaped the world, Ferdinand obsessed over his own private failures. His bedchamber consumed him, and with it, his kingdom. The ominous decade had begun. Spain's monarch, hailed as the Desired One, was proving instead to be a monarch of ruins, destroyer of reforms, tormentor of wives, and tyrant over a people who had expected salvation but received despair. By 1819, Ferdinand's court was desperate. 2 young wives had died, both broken under the weight of his condition, and Spain itself was unraveling. The empire that had once spanned oceans was disintegrating. Revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín were toppling colonial rule across the Americas. Gold and silver shipments dwindled, Spanish authority vanished in the Andes and Mexico, and every loss on the map was a fresh wound to Madrid's pride. In the midst of this geopolitical collapse, the king turned once more to the question that obsessed him above all, producing an heir. His ministers scoured Europe for a princess who might agree to marry a man whose reputation was already infamous. Most courts recoiled, unwilling to offer daughters to a king whose wives seemed to die within years of marriage. At last, one candidate emerged, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a 4-year-old princess, whose family's straitened finances outweighed concern for her well-being. Maria Josepha was different from Ferdinand's previous brides. Older, more pragmatic, and schooled in German efficiency, she approached marriage less as a romance than as a challenge to be managed. Unlike Maria Antonia or Maria Isabel, she was not swept away by illusions of fairy tale unions. She came armed with physicians of her own and medical preparations carefully packed among her trousseau. The wedding, subdued compared to Ferdinand's earlier ceremonies, carried an air of resignation. Europe was watching now with morbid fascination. Whispers spread through diplomatic circles. Would she survive? Would Spain's curse finally end? Or was she simply another lamb to the slaughter? The conjugal life that followed was unlike any royal marriage in memory. Gone were even the faint pretenses of affection. Instead, Maria Josepha instituted a regime of clinical precision. Intimate encounters were scheduled, timed, and observed by physicians. Detailed notes were kept. Which positions were attempted, what devices employed, how long each session lasted. The royal bedchamber became less a place of marriage than a laboratory, its rituals closer to surgery than to love. Her detachment allowed her to endure what had destroyed the others. Where Maria Antonia had turned to laudanum and Maria Isabel to hysteria, Maria Josepha survived by treating the ordeal as a scientific problem to be solved. Yet Ferdinand resented this coldness. To him, her calm was not resilience, but insult. He became convinced she viewed him not as a husband, but as a grotesque curiosity, a specimen to be catalogued. His paranoia flared anew. Spies intercepted her letters back to Saxony, convinced they contained state secrets about his anatomy. All the while, Spain collapsed. Between 1810 and 1825, nearly every Spanish possession in the Americas declared independence. The silver mines of Potosi, the sugar of Havana, the vast markets of Mexico lost. Revolutionary propaganda made brutal use of Ferdinand's failures, portraying him as a monstrous tyrant, impotent in body and spirit, a man unfit to rule. Pamphlets circulated in Mexico City and Buenos Aires, depicting the king as both grotesque and weak, his private shame transformed into a symbol of national liberation. Inside the palace, Ferdinand continued to ignore the ruin of empire. Cabinet meetings were postponed while physicians experimented with new marital techniques. Foreign envoys wrote in disbelief that the fate of an empire hung not on strategy or reform, but on whether the king could manage a single successful act of conception. For a decade, Maria Josepha endured this grim arrangement. The court grew weary, diplomats exchanged knowing glances, and servants whispered that the queen had become more nun than wife, cloistered in duty rather than devotion. Yet in 1829, after 10 years of this clinical marriage, the impossible seemed to happen. Maria Josepha conceived. The palace erupted with hope. Bells rang, dignitaries congratulated, and Ferdinand, now in his mid-40s, strutted with renewed confidence. But the miracle was short-lived. Complications arose in the 7th month, and the child, a daughter, was born prematurely, living only hours. Maria Josepha herself succumbed to childbed fever weeks later, her body too weakened to recover. The tragedy left Ferdinand unhinged. He refused to permit burial, demanding physicians continue reviving mother and child as their bodies decayed in the palace. For nearly a week, the stench of death filled the corridors. Only when reality forced itself upon him did he relent, descending into a black depression so profound that courtiers feared he might not survive it. Spain had lost its queen, its empire was shattered, and its king, still consumed by his private obsessions, drifted deeper into madness. Yet fate had one more turn to play. Before the year's end, Ferdinand would take a fourth wife and with her, a daughter who would inherit his ruined throne. By 1829, the Spanish court could scarcely believe its fortune. After a decade of clinical failure, Queen Maria Josefa of Saxony was finally with child. The announcement fell like a thunderbolt of hope across Madrid. Bells tolled, prayers were sung, and for the first time in years, Ferdinand allowed himself to imagine redemption. An heir at last proof that the curse might be broken, that Spain's king was not condemned to sterility and shame. For months, the palace lived in suspended anticipation. Maria Josefa, quiet and dutiful, bore the pregnancy with patient grace. Ferdinand, however, plunged into obsession. He summoned physicians from across Europe, Italians, Germans, Frenchmen to monitor her condition. He ordered her chambers blessed by priests, fumigated with incense, and guarded by extra sentries to ward off imagined assassins. Even astrologers were consulted, their charts scrutinized to ensure the heavens themselves smiled upon the birth. And then, catastrophe. In the 7th month, Maria Josefa began to suffer bleeding and severe pains. Today we would recognize the signs as placental abruption, a tearing of the placenta that places both mother and child at mortal risk. But in 1829, obstetrics was as much superstition as science. Physicians argued, quarreled, and contradicted one another while Ferdinand hovered, issuing panicked orders. On May 18th, Maria Josefa went into premature labor. The scene that unfolded was less a delivery than a nightmare. Ferdinand insisted on personally overseeing the proceedings, his eyes wild, his commands frantic. The physicians, trapped between their medical instincts and the king's paranoia, stumbled through chaos. Hours later, a tiny girl was born. She lived only a few hours before her fragile body surrendered. Maria Josefa survived the delivery, but barely. Fever set in, a consequence of infection that haunted 19th century childbirth. Within 3 weeks, she too was dead. The miracle had curdled into ruin. A mother and child lowered into coffins almost together, their promise extinguished before it could shine. Ferdinand's reaction horrified even his courtiers. He refused to acknowledge death, demanding that doctors continue their efforts. For nearly a week, the palace corridors stank of decay, while physicians, under royal command, attempted futile resuscitations on corpses. Servants gagged at the odor, guards covered their faces with cloth, but no one dared defy the king. Only when putrefaction made the denial unbearable did Ferdinand relent, collapsing into despair. Grief warped quickly into madness. He stalked the palace like a ghost, refusing to eat, refusing to meet ministers, speaking only to the death masks he had commissioned of his wives. In his private chambers, surrounded by anatomical devices and relics of failure, he muttered to plaster faces as if they could answer. To Spain's suffering people, he was a king restored by miracle. Within the palace, he was a man unhinged by loss, unable to distinguish mourning from delusion. Meanwhile, the kingdom reeled. Spain's American empire was gone, its economy drained, its pride shattered. Yet all attention in Madrid centered on the king's grief, the grotesque theater of a monarch who could not accept death. Diplomats reported home with astonishment, writing of a court where cadavers lay in state beyond reason, where a nation's fate was suspended, while its ruler searched for ways to revive the irretrievable. When Maria Josefa was finally buried beside the queens before her, Ferdinand was left more isolated than ever. 3 wives gone, no heir to secure the dynasty, and a nation cracking under decline. To his courtiers, it was a tragedy. To Ferdinand, it was proof of a conspiracy that fate, or God, or enemies both real and imagined, were determined to rob him of what was rightfully his. Yet even in ruin, the obsession endured. Within months, Ferdinand would begin negotiations for a 4th marriage. The pattern repeated, not a pause for mourning, not reflection on Spain's collapse, but another desperate grasp at dynastic survival. His personal despair had become inseparable from his political tyranny, and every new union would carry both his curse and his paranoia forward into the kingdom's fate. The year 1829 found Ferdinand broken in body and mind. 3 wives buried, no heir alive, Spain in decline. Yet his advisors, desperate to steady the Bourbon line, pressed him toward a 4th marriage. Their chosen candidate was Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, a woman not unlike Ferdinand's first wife. Maria Antonia, a cousin, tied by blood to the same tangled branches of Europe's royal family tree. Maria Cristina was 23 when she arrived in Madrid. Her beauty was remarked upon by courtiers, her manners graceful, her intelligence quick. Yet beneath the silks and ceremonies lay a secret that would define Spain's future. She was already pregnant. Whether Ferdinand knew or chose not to know remains a mystery. What mattered was his desperation. After decades of failure, he was willing to accept any fiction that promised an heir. The marriage was celebrated with solemn pomp, but its hollowness was clear even to foreign observers. Ferdinand looked aged beyond his 45 years, his face bloated, his movements stiff. Maria Cristina walked beside him, radiant yet tense, her hand resting on a womb carrying a child whose paternity the king could not possibly claim. It was a spectacle of mutual deceit. She pretending reverence for her husband, he pretending to believe the child was his own. In October 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. Bells rang across Spain, cannons thundered, and the court erupted in relief. At last, an heir, the continuation of the dynasty secured. But the irony was sharp. The long-awaited solution to Ferdinand's failure arrived not through his own body, but through a deception everyone was forced to accept. The timing was fateful. Only a year earlier, Ferdinand had issued the Pragmatic Sanction, overturning the old Salic law that barred women from inheriting the Spanish crown. It was a direct attempt to ensure that if he produced a daughter, she could succeed him. Now, with Isabella's birth, that law became reality. Yet far from ending Spain's troubles, Isabella's arrival lit the fuse of new ones. Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, refused to accept a female heir. To him and his supporters, Isabella's succession was illegitimate not only because of her sex, but because of the whispered doubts surrounding her parentage. From this seed would grow the Carlist Wars, decades of civil strife that would tear Spain apart long after Ferdinand was in his grave. Within the palace, however, Ferdinand's obsession only deepened. He adored Isabella with a fervor that shocked courtiers, cradling her for hours, staring at her features as though searching for proof she was truly his. At times, he seemed to love her as a father. At other times, his gaze hardened with resentment, as if she were a daily reminder of his failure. He commissioned artists to paint her likeness again and again, comparing her face to his own portraits, to Maria Cristina's, even to those of men she had known before their marriage. It was a fragile fiction, a house of cards upon which rested the future of Spain. The court played along, ministers bowing to the infant princess, ambassadors sending word to Europe that the Bourbon line endured. But everyone knew the truth. The king, who had failed 3 times to produce an heir, had now been blessed with a daughter whose existence depended on silence, denial, and collective pretense. Ferdinand himself seemed trapped in contradiction. He clung to Isabella as proof of legitimacy even as he suspected betrayal. He smiled in public, parading his daughter as the hope of Spain, while in private he demanded assurances, confessions, anything to still the gnawing doubt. His paranoia and his pride twisted together, making every glance at the child both joy and torment. Spain celebrated the birth of a princess, but beneath the jubilation lay unease. Isabella's tiny cry was not only the sound of continuation, it was the herald of conflict to come, a fragile life destined to inherit not only a throne but a kingdom fractured by deceit, mistrust, and rage. By the early 1832, the royal palace of Madrid had become less a court than a labyrinth of suspicion. Ferdinand, bloated with illness and paranoia, no longer trusted the loyalty of his courtiers, his ministers, or even his queen. Every corner seemed to him a potential ambush, every word a cipher, every smile a mask for betrayal. He had turned his kingdom into a stage of shadows where every actor was under watch. Maria Cristina, young and isolated, bore the brunt of this suffocating obsession. What should have been the chambers of a queen became the walls of a cage. Servants reported how Ferdinand had ordered peepholes drilled between their apartments, crudely cut into plaster and concealed behind gilded frames. The king would spend hours at these openings, his eye fixed on Maria Cristina's most private moments when she prayed, when she ate, even when she sat silently in thought. She began to move through her own rooms like an actress performing for an invisible audience, knowing she was never unobserved. The surveillance extended to every detail of her life. Letters were intercepted, copied, and placed before the king. He demanded not only their contents but reports on her expressions while she wrote them. Her meals became elaborate rituals of suspicion. Not one but several tasters sampled her dishes. Each required to wait half an hour before the food was deemed safe. If a servant so much as coughed, the plate would be swept away and replaced. Several tasters collapsed from exhaustion or anxiety, victims of the king's relentless watchfulness. Ferdinand's paranoia infected the entire palace staff. Guards were rotated daily, lest familiarity breed treachery. Ministers endured bizarre loyalty tests. The king would state a deliberate falsehood in private and watch if anyone dared to correct him. Silence meant safety. Contradiction meant treason. Courtiers learned to speak in riddles, to bow too deeply rather than risk too shallow, to adopt faces of polished neutrality as if their very features might betray them. The costs of this obsession were staggering. Secret passages were ordered carved through the palace so Ferdinand could move unseen, trailing guards through hidden corridors like a man pursued by ghosts. He commissioned angled mirrors to reflect conversations from hallways into his chambers, convinced he could detect plots by observing gestures from afar. The crown's dwindling treasury, already drained by wars abroad and collapse in the Americas, bled further into these delusions, financing a surveillance state built on fear. Maria Christina's spirit frayed under the constant pressure. Letters later discovered in Naples reveal her torment. "I live in a glass cage," she wrote, "where every breath is observed, and every prayer weighed for signs of treason." Her health faltered, hair fell from stress, her weight fluctuated dangerously, and tremors shook her hands. Yet in public she remained composed, a queen performing serenity while privately unraveling. To the outside world, the Bourbon court still glittered. Ambassadors attended banquets, orchestras played, chandeliers blazed. But behind the spectacle lay dread. Foreign envoys reported home of a king consumed by phantoms, a palace where whispers could mean exile, where servants vanished overnight. It was not just a royal household under surveillance, it was a kingdom. The same paranoia Ferdinand directed at his queen seeped into his governance. The Inquisition, revived under his hand, was turned toward rooting out slander against the monarchy. Ordinary Spaniards learned that careless remarks at taverns or in family kitchens might end in interrogation. What had begun as Ferdinand's private obsession metastasized into national policy. Thus, the palace became a hall of mirrors, each reflecting Ferdinand's deepest fear: mockery, betrayal, impotence. His body had made him a prisoner since childhood. Now his mind made prisoners of everyone around him. Maria Christina, trapped in the king's gaze, learned to breathe in silence, to pray without moving her lips, to exist as quietly as possible in a world where even a glance could be read as treason. By the final years of Ferdinand's reign, Spain was a hollowed kingdom. The people had once hailed him as El Deseado, the desired one. But desire had long since rotted into disillusion. His paranoia, first confined to the palace, had metastasized into the machinery of government. Diplomacy withered, finances collapsed, and Spain found itself mocked across Europe. Foreign ambassadors, who had once competed for influence at Madrid, now reported home with alarm. They described a court unfit for treaties, led by a king who delayed audiences for weeks because he was consulting astrologers about propitious nights for conception. They wrote of councils postponed because the monarch was locked in his chambers, testing new marital contraptions, while matters of war and debt languished. To Vienna and London, Madrid had become less a capital than a madhouse, where a kingdom's fate was held hostage by a man obsessed with his bed. Diplomacy suffered accordingly. Marriage negotiations, a traditional tool of Bourbon power, stalled. Courts in France, Austria, and even smaller German states hesitated to offer princesses, knowing Ferdinand's previous brides had either perished or been humiliated. Some families demanded unprecedented conditions: separate apartments, independent physicians, even personal guards to ensure their daughter's survival. These demands insulted Ferdinand, feeding his paranoia that foreign courts were conspiring to ridicule him. At home, the treasury drained like water through cracked stone. Years of colonial revolt had stripped Spain of its American empire. Silver from Potosi, sugar from Havana, dyes from Veracruz, all gone. The riches that once filled Madrid's coffers now fueled the independence of new republics across the Atlantic. What remained of Spain's economy was squandered on Ferdinand's obsessions: networks of spies, armies of food tasters, elaborate alarm systems, and craftsmen commissioned to design increasingly bizarre marital aids. The costs were grotesque. Where once artisans had produced jewelry, weapons, and furniture, now they labored in secret workshops, crafting padded restraints, adjustable cushions, and mechanisms that blurred the line between medicine and torture. These devices consumed royal funds while peasants starved in the countryside. Every coin spent on a contraption was a coin not spent on bread. Spain's subjects felt the weight. Taxes climbed, wages collapsed, and famine stalked provinces already gutted by war. Banditry spread in the countryside, revolution simmered in the cities. But when petitions reached the palace, they found Ferdinand distracted. Ministers waited in gilded halls while the king paced, muttering about betrayals in his wife's letters or conspiracies among his guards. Urgent matters, grain shortages, uprisings, bankruptcies were delayed until his paranoia allowed him to listen. The contrast with the rest of Europe was humiliating. Britain's industrial revolution thundered ahead. France rebuilt its prestige after Napoleon. Even the smaller German states were modernizing their armies and administrations. Spain, once the master of empires, had become a punchline, a land ruled by a king, so warped by private shame that he squandered his nation's last reserves on suspicion and contraptions. At court, survival demanded silence. Ministers learned to flatter, to echo the king's delusions, to agree that his wife's prayers might indeed conceal treason. Some recorded their horror in secret diaries, noting how entire meetings were consumed not by policy but by Ferdinand's monologues about imagined plots. A single raised eyebrow, a breath drawn too sharply, could end a career or a life. By 1832, the kingdom was staggering. Spain's debt ballooned, its credit shriveled, and its people starved, while their king demanded ever more elaborate precautions. He saw conspiracies everywhere coded in compliments, hidden in flower arrangements, whispered by servants in kitchens. The machinery of state no longer served the nation. It served Ferdinand's paranoia. Thus, Spain drifted toward collapse, dragged down not only by external losses, but by a ruler whose private torment had become national ruin. Diplomacy was a dead letter, the economy a corpse, and the palace itself a grotesque symbol of a kingdom ruled by fear. By 1832, the toll of Ferdinand's obsessions had begun to show on his body. Once thick and heavyset, he now trembled with every step. Insomnia left his eyes bloodshot, his skin blotched with rashes, his digestion racked by spasms his physicians could neither soothe nor explain. Courtiers spoke in whispers of a king unraveling, a man who drifted between raving suspicion and vacant stupor. His speeches, once stiff but coherent, dissolved into rambling accusations. He spoke of conspiracies that existed only in his imagination, ordering investigations into poison plots no one could trace. Ministers endured hours of incoherent tirades, each word weighed for hidden insult, each silence punished as betrayal. The palace became a theater of madness. As his strength waned, the political crisis deepened. The pragmatic sanction of 1830, naming Isabella as heir, had already provoked opposition from Don Carlos and his supporters. As Ferdinand weakened, Carlist factions gathered strength, preparing to challenge the succession. Spain teetered on the edge of civil war. Yet its king was consumed not by politics, but by suspicion staring at his infant daughter's face as though it contained the secrets of legitimacy. By 1833, his decline was irreversible. Gout crippled him, infections festered, and what his doctors described as nervous agitation robbed him of lucidity. He spent his final days drifting between muttering to his dead wives and demanding new tests of his food. At times, he called for Isabella, holding her tiny hand, as if willing her to be proof of his victory over nature. At others, he cursed her existence, a living reminder that his greatest triumph producing an heir had been achieved only through deceit. On the 29th of September 1833, Ferdinand VII died. Official bulletins spoke of gout and natural decline, but his physicians knew better. He had simply collapsed under decades of exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual. A man who had never found peace in life, finally found it in death. Yet even then, secrecy clung to his body. An autopsy was performed in secret by the same physicians who had spent years tending to his impossible anatomy. What they found was a grotesque confirmation of rumor, an organ preserved at 14 inches in length, swollen and distorted, scarred from decades of attempted self-surgeries. Evidence showed that Ferdinand, desperate and ashamed, had tried to alter his own body with crude tools in youth wounds that never healed, deformities that only worsened with time. The relic was sealed away, locked in Vatican archives, a state secret too dangerous and too humiliating to expose. His death left Spain fractured. Isabella II, scarcely 3 years old, inherited a throne already in flames. The Carlist wars erupted almost immediately, plunging the nation into decades of civil strife. Abroad, Spain's reputation as a great power was gone. Once the master of oceans, it was now a minor player mocked by Europe, its decline embodied in the grotesque figure of the king who had ruled it into ruin. Ferdinand's legacy was more than failed marriages, more than political repression. It was the proof that the private torment of one man could metastasize into national catastrophe. His shame became Spain's humiliation. His paranoia became Spain's governance. His inability to create life gave birth instead to endless conflict. His wives died in despair, his subjects in poverty, his kingdom in chaos. And yet, he achieved a kind of immortality, not as the desired one he longed to be, not as the savior of Spain, but as a cautionary tale, a monarch remembered not for glory but for grotesquerie, not for wisdom but for weakness. His preserved organ, hidden in dark archives, stands as a chilling monument, the most intimate of human failures made into a symbol of political ruin. When the physician completed his final grim duty sealing away the relic of the king's shame, he must have understood the irony. A body deformed by nature had become the emblem of a reign that deformed a nation. Ferdinand VII, the most perverted king in history, had at last found peace. Spain, however, would bleed for generations from wounds he left behind.